Noswaith croeso cynnes I chi gyd yn y darlithfa a hefyd adref a Zoom, probably a lot drier at home on Zoom. Croeso i'r trydydd darlith, Amy Dillwyn. Welcome everybody here and at home on Zoom. I think there are about 60 odd people watching behind one of those cameras, so hello. This is the third Amy Dillwyn lecture. I'm Kirsty Boharter, Professor of English here at Swansea and also co-director of CREW, which is the Centre for Research into the English Literature and Language of Wales. CREW established the Amy Dillwyn lecture, named after the Swansea novelist and feminist campaigner. It's a lecture that focuses on women's writing and women writers from Wales. So it's a lecture about or delivered by a Welsh woman writer. And this year we are enormously privileged to have Professor Charlotte Williams. Charlotte's transformative memoir, Sugar and Slate, there you go, still out there if you want to run out and buy a copy. It was first published in 2002 and it was instantly hailed as a classic of Welsh writing in English, and it won the Wales Book of the Year at the time. And 20 years on, it has now taken its rightful place in the Library of Wales series of Welsh classics, with a foreword by the eminent scholar of African American literature, Hazel Carby, who in the foreword explains her own personal and professional connections to the book, her responses to the book. Charlotte herself is a distinguished scholar in her own right, Professor Emeritus at Bangor University. She has published widely on race and ethnicity studies, often adopting a cross-disciplinary approach, drawing on history, social sciences, literary and post-colonial studies. And she has taken her expertise forwards towards applied studies, focusing in particular on impacts for policy and professional practices. She was awarded an OBE in the 2007 Queen's New Year's Honours List for services to ethnic minorities and equalities in Wales. And in 2010, she was awarded the Service to Wales Award at the Wales Recognising Achievement Awards. In 2020 and 2021, Charlotte chaired the Ministerial Working Group, Communities, Contributions and Cynefin, Black, Asian and minority ethnicities in the new curriculum, which reported in March 21, I think. Yeah. And since then has been involved also in work with the Welsh Government on the Education Workforce Wales and with Qualifications Wales on the implementation phase of those recommendations, recommendations in the report that she chaired, which impacts on every school in Wales and what they learn in history. So this evening, Charlotte is talking about spaces of possibility, Cymru-Cynefin and Canons revisited.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Diolch, Kirsty. Noswaith dda pawb. Diolch yn fawr iawn am y gwahoddiad. I'm delighted to be here and it's really, really lovely. Hello to those who are watching on Zoom. But it's really lovely to be face-to-face at last, having given presentations online for the last couple of years. Yeah, it's a great honour to deliver the Amy Dillwyn lecture and being recognised as a Welsh writer. So last year, I gave a presentation to the Books Council Wales to their AGM. And at that point, I challenged the audience to give or to think about 3 writers of colour from Wales. And I think they would have been, you know, a little stumped. It's a tricky question, and it was obviously a provocative question. And clearly I was signalling those issues of representation in the literature of Wales that I want to pick up on again. And I often ask myself this funny kind of question where I say, if Wales is a predominantly white society, and if authors in Wales are predominantly white, will we ever get Black protagonists in the literature or Black characters in the literature of Wales. So I'll leave that one with you for a while. In 2022, we had a different picture or a different profile of what's happening in Wales. So here we have Nafida Mohammed's book, reaching Welsh Book of the Year, a wonderful book that it is. We have Angela Hui, I don't know if you heard her podcast where she was talking about growing up in a Chinese restaurant. Wonderfully, Hannah Nissa is appointed as the national poet. And there were several books, Welsh Plural, Jessica Dunrod's book, children's book, well, a couple of books, but sort of breaks out and adds to the children's literature of Wales. And delightfully, Sugar and Slate is taken into the canon, into the Library of Wales. Y'all can bow for that. That's lovely. And so we should ask, and as a social scientist, I would ask, what's going on? What, what's happening here? What's so different? When Hazel Carby gave the Richard Burton lecture in 2020, Daniel Gwydion, the wonderful Daniel Gwydion, suggested her as adding to, I quote, almost a body of literary work on Wales, Welshness and ethnic diversity. And I thought, oh gosh, that's such an interesting idea. What might constitute that body of work? What might its nature be? What could be said about this idea? So in this commentary this evening, and I say commentary, I wanted to take on 3 questions. One of them is to ask, are we seeing a tangible shift? What is it that we are seeing in the national literature? And if we are, why now? How has this evolved? Touching in on that representation issue. And then I want to ask, what does this type of literature represent? How does it relate to the broader Black British canon? What does it contribute to Welsh writing in English? And finally, just say something about what I think are some of its impacts and potentials. Maybe you'll allow me to drop in on the curriculum a little bit and on the whole idea of decolonising education. So those are my questions for tonight. I did want to say that these are like my observations as a writer and reader. This isn't my academic speciality, although as Kirsty has described, I'm quite happy to dip my toe in other disciplines. So maybe I'll do that. And I'm sort of basing it a little bit on the fact that in 2004, I was on the judging panel of Welsh Book of the Year. And that at that time, you read all the books in all the categories. And then last year, I was on the panel of Welsh Book of the Year for the non-fiction category. But then again, we dip in and read across. So I'm kind of thinking about what I saw in that respect. So what is it we're seeing is the first question. Is there some kind of tangible shift, and what's prompted it? When I won Welsh Book of the Year some 20 years ago, I remember saying in my thank you speech, maybe I was the first writer of colour to win Welsh Book of the Year, but I hoped that many would follow. And it's taken till this year for that to happen. But calls have been emerging nationally and internationally for more diverse literatures. In particular, the decolonising education movement has been pushing forward, and the Black History movement has been pushing forward in terms of these issues of representation. So there's quite a long story leading into this. And it's true that writers of colour have struggled to get published in every constituency of the UK. Literature in general has lacked representation of Black figures and protagonists. And then there's also a kind of general critique of the publishing industry itself as white. So the first thing to think about is where and how do we appear in the national literature? And this question has provoked some interrogation. Graham Davis, some time ago, 2011, wrote a book, The Dragon and the Crescent, Wales and Islam, where he looked at 170 literary extracts in these terms, fiction, poetry, autobiography, and so on, and found a very sort of cursory or nominal attention to Muslim characters in Welsh writing. It was interesting that he was asking the question. More recently, Lisa Shepherd's work, Cymru, the Dillwyn, also interrogated representation of different forms of cultural otherness in contemporary Welsh fiction. And again, she found a light touch, some writers featuring black characters, but often in rather sensationalized and particularistic ways. 2017 Wales Arts Review could cite just about half a dozen black writers with strong connections to Wales, who, I quote, should be celebrated and known for their work and achievement. So we have had some roundups looking at this very issue. We do, of course, recognise the important role literature has in authenticating and validating national identities, local and regional identities, right from Raymond Williams's Border Country with its vivid landscapes and physical and metaphysical borders that we see, say, in Niall Griffiths' work or in Owen Shear's work. Place matters, is my point. Of course, good literature stretches beyond national boundary, but it also serves to confirm and reflect national identity and character. So the events of 2020 provided the trigger of the Black Lives Matter movement. And we've seen, indeed, a number of developments and incentives that have emerged following that. I was reading Gary Raymond recently, I don't know if you saw his article, where he said, it's misguided to think important writing gains cultural prominence organically. What's needed, he argues, is money, investment, media, exposure, and movement. And by movement, he was talking about things like Welsh Book of the Year and the Hay Festival and so on. And I just wanted to add to the end of his essay and say, but you need also cultural power. There's something about power there that's going to sort of change the profile. So long before Black Lives Matter movements, I came across these young writers, poets and artists who were trying to increase the voice and representation of people of colour in literature. I don't know if you know about the open mic initiatives, but they were very interesting, and I sort of picked my ears up about them. And this predates the kind of trigger of the Black Lives Matter movement. But since that time, we've seen a number of really encouraging and broad developments addressing this issue. For example, the Penguin Books Lit in Colour initiative, which you probably know about, where they looked at the diet of children's books in terms of representation of Black, Asian and minority ethnic peoples, where they have taken on a number of initiatives aimed at promoting and encouraging writers of colour. And Bernardine Evaristo, when she won the Booker Prize, she developed this Writing Back series where she's looking to retrieve books that have been overlooked in the past and bring them to prominence. I was really happy to be part of the British Council's Writers' Mosaic website, which has done a kind of UK-wide trawl and encouraged writers of colour to present their work. It's a very interesting website. Darren Chetty, our Darren Chetty, has done work on children's literature in the Beyond the Secret Garden project. I think these are worth recognising and reiterating in this story that I'm telling. And of course, Literature Wales had this special initiative representing Wales 2020, where they were looking to develop writers of colour and really, I suppose, promote their writing, but also introduce them to the whole kind of literary infrastructure. Books Council Wales New Audiences Grant is also very important because it looks really to projects that may put Black writers into journalism or into publishing and so on and so forth. So there've been, you know, a number of initiatives there aimed at changing this picture of representation. And I wrote a short review some time ago in Planet, and I made the point that the entire print culture of Wales, its ecosystem, the whole infrastructure would need to work together to produce a more diverse literary output. We need more journalists, more authors, illustrators, book reviewers, literary agents, and publishers. And I'm thinking of this as a kind of collective endeavour. I'll be really honest with you. I don't think it's a reasonable idea to pillory small publishing houses for their staff profile, for example. What we need to be looking is at the framework across Wales in terms of this issue of representation. And I doubt they were listening to me, but the Welsh Government has also made clear its objectives in terms of holding public bodies in arts and culture into account in the anti-racist Wales by 2030 plan that you can easily download, where they talk about arts and culture as a powerful vehicle for communicating unity and cohesion, and suggest that public bodies must be accountable in encouraging active and equal access to participation in all forms of culture. That said, I've heard other arguments. Organisations concerned to showcase diversity in projecting an image of themselves as a modern and progressive organisation, or an image of a modern and progressive Wales, not matched by attention to systematic inequalities that underpin the sector. We know, as Black people, how easy it is to represent a portrait of modernisation without attaining real equality. I think Louis Gates Jr. called that the Benetton, you remember the Benetton shops? We took Benetization of race, a common feature of the so-called post-racial society. So it's important to ask, is this a tangible shift? Will it last? How will it be sustained? Is it a product of the trigger of Black Lives Matter movement, or are we going to see something much more substantive in terms of what we mean by representation? The social science of the matter suggests optimism in this respect. So I'm travelling hopefully. A willingness to grapple with the issue of representation, which is indeed complex, and take us well beyond the how many head count to talk about processes and approaches that represent true engagement. So there we are. In terms of my first question, I like these kinds of puzzles about, you know, whether small underfunded publishing houses can reasonably be called to account for their staff profile. Questions about what is the sustainability or the sustainable way forward in terms of representation. And that funny one about, you know, if the publishing world is white and the authors are white and we live in a predominantly white society, will we get real characters, real protagonists who are from Black, Asian or minority communities? Okay, so moving on to my second deep dive, what does this type of literature contribute? This is the canons bit. And yeah, I think I can. I'm going to start with this very, very old poem by Joseph Seaman Cotter. I don't know if you've seen it before. This is the mulatto, the mixed race person speaking to his critics. He says, ashamed of my race and of what race I am many in one. Through my veins runs the blood of red man, black man, Briton, Celt and Scot. In warring clash and tumultuous riot, I welcome all, but love the blood of the kindly race that sways my skin, crinkles my hair, and puts sweet music into my soul. What I think Joseph Seaman Cotter is marking out all of that time ago is the multivariousness of Black heritages. This idea that Stuart Hall, the cultural theorist, took up when he said to do away with this innocent notion of the essentialized Black subject, that there is many and diverse representations of being Black and being Black in Britain. And what, if I'm suggesting that the Welsh writing in English canon was not expressing or representing Black writing very well, then in a way the Black British literature canon was also to be found wanting in terms of this wide variety of voices that we see across the UK. And that too is changing. Black Britain has many voices and indeed many accents. And Susan Scaife, for example, talks about these new articulations as spaces of possibility, or what Raymond Williams back then called placeable social identities. But I think what was clear was that the way in which the Black British canon of writing evolved had very much a metropolitan focus. For short form, we might say the Windrush narrative somehow prescribes the idea of Black British writing. And it's taken writers such as Jackie Kay, I don't know if you know the book Out of Bounds, to begin to put forward the fact that there's a huge diversity of experience that needs to be represented in the literature. And I just want to talk about this huge diversity in the literature, because the way I have thought about them is very much, of these writings, is very much as kind of decentering trajectories in terms of the Black British canon. And what do these decentering trajectories do? Now, this is a rather overloaded PowerPoint slide, but I did want to give some examples of different writers who are identifying this out of boundsness being way beyond the metropolitan experience of the Black British canon. So you've got Warmington talking about expanding the registers through which British experiences can be written. And John MacLeod talking about minor perspectival interventions that contribute to reimagining Britishness, announcing hybrid cultural identities and transnational connectivities that refract the political and social contradictions of Britishness itself. And MacLeod in later papers talks about infusing the Black British canon with twists and turns of multilingualism hyphenated experiences, ideological trajectories, new spatialities, and varieties of geographical attachment that recraft the focus of Black writing. And so on. Mark Steen again talks about the way in which these kinds of literatures open up, transgress space and certain spatialities, depicting racist phenomena, redressing the iconography of Britain, and through the exertion of cultural power. So, yeah, I like to see them as decentering the canon, but also decentering away from the kind of London centricity of a lot of writing, demanding alternative recognitions and alternative readings. I'm going to, jump on a little bit. Yeah, so when I was writing Sugar and Slate, I did feel a responsibility somehow to challenge the kind of dominant projections of national identity. I suppose it was a post-devolution book in that sense, drawing attention to this kind of sub-national level and the Black experience within the sub-national level, and the ways in which Britishness is being reshaped in an era of cultural globalization. And I wanted to inscribe these kinds of transnational crossings and connections across borders, both literal and imaginary. Mark Steen does talk about these kinds of novels as novels of transformation. And he also argues that they have performative functions that reach out beyond the text. And I want to say a little bit about that later. But before I talk about the kind of distinct stylecraft that I think you can find in this book, I want to return to some of those kinds of organizing frames that are offered by the idea of canon. So if we talked about, in the strictest sense, if we talk about the Black British canon, we could take Deirdre Osborne's framework here, where she divides the literature into using E.R. Braithwaite's term arriviste of the 40s and 50s, those kind of books that reflected arrival, like Sam Selvon's Lonely Londoners, lovely book. And then moving into 70s and 80s, she refers to the settler kind of literature, and that might be, say, Beryl Gilroy's Black Teacher, or Lyndon Kwesi Johnson's England is a Bitch. I love that poem. And then Deirdre suggests towards more indigeny that we see from the 90s and 2000s onward. And I was sort of trying to think about this framework in terms of Black writing in Wales and what kinds of legacies that we have, if you suggest it in this distinctive way. And of course, Kirsty had written this wonderful chapter in The Tolerant Nation, where she talked about this anthropological treachery of the 19th century imagery, the way in which Black figures and race and gender are represented in that literature in, well, quite, what's the word, Kirsty, kind of not very nice representations, let's say it like that. So, that's one legacy that we might be carrying with us. And then I was thinking about books that reflected the need for recognition, defining an experience of living in a locality. And I would put, for example, Neil Sinclair's work in this kind of area, where they're talking about, could we be recognized as a community? What's it like to live in that community? That kind of Butetown history and arts literature. And of course, we don't necessarily in Wales have a collective point of arrival, an arriviste moment We don't necessarily have this kind of sense of having made a migratory journey and, you know, talking about the sea crossings and moments of exile that you would see in the Black British canon, mainly because we've been there for generations, and, you know, that's what the Bute Town literature tells us. And then the locality kinds of changes more to a locale, and the locale's got a kind of political inflection in it, where the argument becomes, we don't want to be represented like that. You know, this is a truer reflection of us as a people, and you begin to see a literature that represents that. But the literature that I've really been interested in, I've called Redux, and this is the kind of mixed race literature that we are seeing in contemporary Wales now, much more concerned with a Cynefin of locatedness. So in Cynefin there's locality, in Cynefin there's locale, but there's also locatedness, and I think some of these literatures reflect that in different ways. And I'll try and describe that a little bit better than I am. But if we went back to the 80s, and I wrote about this way back, and I said back in the 80s, the connection between race and place was a very different matter. We weren't Welsh, we were local. We weren't ethnic minorities, we were Black. We weren't a collective in any Wales sense, but a scattered, largely invisible peoples. We were the dispossessed. Back in the 80s, if asked, one of our number might say something like, I'm a Mardy boy, or I'm from Bute Town, or I live in Llanrydder, Llanrumney, Llangollen. None of us were prepared to say, I'm Welsh, even if we knew it in our private lives. And I think that's somehow a reflection of that transition from describing an experience of, I suppose, being Black in a place and the experience of making that place somehow your own, and describing the experience of Black Britishness or Black Welshness. And more recently, I've talked about Cynefin a lot and said, you know, it's not just a given, like it's there, but it's a gift for us to make and remake in this sense. Okay, I've done a big diversion from my notes here, but it's no matter, I think you're still with me. So if I was grouping some of the kinds of literature that we have available to us, I would talk about the archiving and the unsettling of the record in writing, and the work in the Bute Town History and Art Centre and the oral histories, and the way in which those have been captured as storytelling, maybe not written, but as oral stories, are part of the legacy that we have. And to that kind of unsettling the record, meaning we don't want to be represented in the ways that you are representing us, comes Nafika Mohammed's Fortune Men. She returns to that locality, but animates it in a very particular way, which I think's fascinating. She draws out vivid depictions of multiculturalism, vivid depictions of conflict and difference and diversity, and a very much a lived experience in Fortune Men. And of course, we've had Hazel Carby's marvelous book, Imperial Intimacies, that tells us that story a bit more academically. And then, as I mentioned, we've had life writing and the locality stories, and the locality and identity stories, and Neil Sinclair's Tiger Bay stories and beyond are interesting examples, I think, of that. I particularly like what Neil did in terms of starting to develop a concept of what he called Afro-Welsh, but he also gives us a different Welsh mam, you know, a mother he kind of addresses that huge conceptual, I don't know, that concept that has carried so much weight in Welsh literature by presenting a different kind of mother, a Welsh mum that isn't quite the traditional. And of course, we've got great writing in terms of asylum and settlement. Eric Nagali Charles's work is good in that respect, great example. And then we have the mixed race writing that I want to talk a little bit about, that Leonora Brito's That's Love, my own work, Patience Akbarbi, sorry about the spelling mistake, Akbarbi, Hannah Nissa and Marvin Thompson are just examples. And of course, I'm leaving out people who are very, very important in this respect. So we have got a legacy. We have got a literature that we could draw together and perhaps analyse in terms of what they represent for the development of Black writing in Wales. Just checking on the time. I wanted to talk particularly about this idea of the redux and the emergence of mixed race writing, because as a writer called Jim Pines has noted, how the question at issue has been a shift from the representation of the experience of being Black in Britain, he says, Black in Wales, to a quite different questions of what it is to be Black and British or Black and Welsh. And the latter signals the immense diversity of experience, the complex sets of relationships within a politics of location. What we're doing, how we're fashioning it, how we're making it live. These personal geographies that evoke questions of scale, that signify the importance of place in our lives and how that shapes our agency. I'm suggesting that there's almost a schemata of mixed race writing that represents a new aesthetic endeavour within Black writing in Britain. A stylizing that addresses heritage and place in particular ways and with an assumed authority. It's not so much the question mark claiming so characteristic of the early Black British canon, but it has the authority of, in Stuart Hall's words, roots, and the authority of roots. And tentatively, I suggest this type of writing deploys some techniques, strategies, tropes that have strong literary traditions in the Celtic countries, and they draw on these influences, literal, ideological, and the cultural heritages that we know in our literature. So some examples of this redux that I've put up here are Leonora Brito, these early stories that she wrote, that if you go back to them, you can see this crafting, this very particular crafting. The first example, she says, this summer my body looks as if it's been mapped out in different shades, black, gold, brown, and my hair, after it's been washed, springs up from my head like a rainforest, an Amazon rainforest. It seems funny to be thinking about a continent when you've always been brought up on an island. I think she gives us the transnational, she gives us the ordinary, she gives us the everyday person, and she, you know, places that Wales in its world, but in a small back garden. And in Going for a Song, she looks out to the countryside, and the protagonist says, they can see the fields. They go up over the hills like squares on a blanket. There are cows inside the fields lying down. The big black patches of their backs look like 2, 4, 6, 8, 10, 12, 14, 15 Africas painted in ink on their creamy white backs like maps. And there are many, there are many examples. I was reading Fortune Men very recently, and she said, even in London, you won't find the pretty girls with a grandparent from each continent that you just stumble into in Tiger Bay. So these are kind of resonating with place, but drawing big kind of global parallels. And you can find that in Hannah Nissa's work. You can find it in Marvin Thompson's poems. I think there's an incident, Marvin Thompson gives us place on Pending Beach, an incident in Screwfix in Pontnewydd, when he calls the Baboon Chronicles, and he ponders the identities of his mixed-race children while searching for Anansi with his mixed-race children in Blind Brand Community Woodland. So here we are. What is going on here? What is this redux? And this brings me to my point about what some of this bundle reveals. Well, firstly, it represents a counter discourse to the Britishness, Englishness that has been assumed in the Black British literary imaginary. It provides other dimensions to the debate. But this discourse, I think, is formulated in its own terms with its own audience, style, and preoccupation. I think, secondly, it extends multiculturalism. It's taken multiculturalism away from that urban focus and extended it to all parts of Britain, which is very important for us all. The literature has enhanced that. It opens up the concept of mixed race writing via a mixed positioning that speaks to the wider development of Black writing in Britain and the wider progressive development of Britishness itself. And it takes us beyond subjectivities. These aren't stories that just about me. I was very anxious about that in Sugar and Slate. Sugar and Slate isn't a story simply about my subjectivity, but it actually wants to provide an example of this stylecraft that's addressing these wider questions of Wales and Welshness. It raises questions about what counts, what's recognised and by whom in what Whitaker calls power geographies. And I think perhaps above all, it enables a physical embodiment in the delivery of the text. When I reflect back on my ambition with Sugar and Slate, I really felt that performing the text, taking the text out and reading it in different places, particularly in spheres that I hadn't been in ever, like a drum in Aberystwyth and so on, you're actually, I suppose, in those terms, creolizing the space in some ways, which I think is very, very important dimension of these texts. They certainly bring new audiences. So in my own example, I took Wales and I was reading it in African countries. I've taken Sugar and Slate and I've been reading it in the Caribbean. So you're taking Wales to its world, which I think is a great thing. And perhaps one overlooked point is that it demands two-way learning. It demands those writers of colour exploring and excavating the Welsh literary tradition and learning from the Welsh literary tradition in order to make that intervention. I'm going to just wind up a little bit now because of time. So there are some of the spaces of possibility that I've described, the counter narratives, the reclaiming histories that, that's a very important dimension of these books. These new stylistic forms, I haven't been able to go into a lot, that's kind of stylistic thing, but I think there's definitely something there to be recognized. The spatialities, the performative embodiment, and the fact that it rejects the binaries that are so often offered by the canon, if you like. So thinking about the last question, it really asks then, what are the implications of the literature? What are the implications of these kinds of writing and the grouping that I suggested? Daniel, before you came, I was saying that after Hazel Carby's lecture, you had said this thing about potentially a canon, you know, potentially a collection of work has emerged from Wales, and that's what triggered my whole thinking. So that remains in this space a possibility. I could talk all day about the reshaping of the curriculum that is needed and that is wanted and desired, and it's really great to have worked with the working group on thinking about what resources are needed for the future. But it's clear that we do need books from Wales, we need a literature from Wales, we need a literature that represents the children and young people of Wales. And the teachers and practitioners are crying out for it. So there's an important need to reshape the curriculum and a big contribution to be made. I think I've argued that this type of literature is beginning to shift the parameters of Welsh writing in English in very particular ways, in terms of some of the stylistic techniques that it's introduced. There's a potential in the literature to animate the historical record. I think it's Hazel Carby who says history is insufficient if it's missed out certain stories. And here we can see many of those stories are being kind of returned to and resurrected by Black writers. And as I said before, I don't see Cynefin as a given. I think it's our responsibility to work in a different way and to think about locality and place and the ambivalences that has for some and the kinds of connections and disconnections it produces. And then there's an important thing to be said more generally about cultural democracy, about a culture that can reflect many different voices and the range of voices and reach many different audiences. And these kinds of texts are beginning to open that up. There is a point that I was touching on earlier, that many of the kind of way in which mixed race literature, for want of a better term, has been seen, has been very much about the angst of mixedness, the trope of the mixed race person, a kind of confessional character, MacLeod says, that's experienced some kind of experiential transformation. And I was trying to avoid that a little bit in Sugar and Slate. I look back now and think, you know, maybe was a bit like that, but that's not what these texts are about, is what I'm saying. They actually represent a much more kind of polycultural admixture, a much more clear kind of sense of fusion, producing the idea of a mixed location in itself and a mixed location for all, rather than talking about a particular subjectivity. So my last words then. I have argued that something new is going on here in terms of the Black British canon and Welsh writing in English. And I've made a particular claim about pushing out multicultural trajectories, spatially and culturally for everyone, opening up spaces of possibility for all. That's the critical negotiation, I think, is going on. And I've suggested that there are some new stylistic forms being forged that are worthy of examination. That work goes over to you to do. Will there be more of these books who decides? Those are the biggest questions about cultural power, about opportunity, about chance and change, about whether these are genuine spaces of possibility that will be sustained. Yes, we have seen texts that take us away from the kind of London centricity of it all to these positions of liminality where these things can happen. And I think what we see in these kinds of books is, yes, a reinvention of the local, but also the possibility to take us beyond inscribing the nation to new political concerns. I think it's very clear that Black writers aren't only going to write about identity. They aren't only going to write about racism. They aren't only going to write about Black history Wales. They are going to write about lots of political concerns that are going to take them to the everyday, love, intimacy, all sorts of things that they can, science fiction and so on. And I think finally, they are aiding the transformation of audiences because they're expanding Welsh literature globally and they're bringing new audiences into the literature of Wales. So those are my claims. Thank you very much for listening. I hope I have said something of interest to you. Diolch yn fawr iawn.
I'm going to just invite Professor Wyn Thomas to say a few words to conclude the formal part of this evening. Wyn is the single most distinguished scholar in the field of Welsh writing in English, as well as being a leading scholar of the American poet Walt Whitman. He founded CREW, the centre that organised this talk this evening, I think about nearly 40 years ago. I'm being vague about this, but it was a significant step in establishing the whole field of Welsh writing in English. He was also a founding fellow of the Learned Society for Wales, who have kindly co-sponsored this event this evening, and served as one of its first vice presidents. So I'm not going to embarrass him any further, but I am very grateful that he has accepted the invitation to offer a vote of thanks this evening.
I don't know what Kirsty wants from me, but anyway, thank you very much. A diolch I chi.
Thank you.
Diolch yn fawr iawn I chi am ddarlith ddiddorol, dadlennol, a meddylgar. Thank you very much indeed. I won't keep you long. Amy Dillwyn, it's the memorial lecture of Amy Dillwyn. And Amy Dillwyn, as you all know, was a mold breaker. She was a female industrialist. She was a cross-dresser. She was a doughty campaigner for the rights of women and a confident novelist. And therefore, I can't think of a better, more appropriate lecturer for the Amy Dillwyn Memorial Lecture than Professor Charlotte Williams, who's also been a mold breaker. A remarkable figure, I think, in the history of recent history of Welsh culture. It's now 20 years since I responded to an invitation from the Culture Committee of the Welsh Government to submit evidence, and during the course of which I suggested they might consider funding a series of classic reprint of classic Welsh texts in English. And since I just come back from Harvard, been visiting professor there, and I'd been mixing with one of the founding editors of the great American Library of America, I suggested, why not have the Library of Wales? And that came about. And I was delighted, as I am tonight, that your book should now be included in it. But let me just add, it is scandalous. It's taken 20 years for that to happen. I can't think, can you, Richard, of another title in our series by a Welsh writer who is Black? I can't think of. That's what. I was very glad you mentioned Leonora Brittle. She passed away tragically young.
Yes.
And I remember reading that collection of short stories,
Yeah.
you know, That's Love.
Yeah, so
And
lovely.
thinking, wow, this is revelatory. I also remember reading your book, Trivial said, which I thought was absolutely classic from the beginning. I mean, it's electrifying. It's interesting. It's a hybrid in itself, isn't it? It's partly personal memoir, and it's partly cultural history, and that seems appropriate, really, to your subject tonight. The whole business of, in a way, hybridity, Black and Welsh, and all the rest of it. You know, and you use that nice term of being Persian, a cultural fault line. Well, of course, my first language is Welsh. I grew up on a cultural fault line.
Yes.
I know a bit about negotiating that. I'm still doing it, frankly. So we should, particularly those of us who speak Welsh, we should have a natural sympathy with others similarly situated. I'm not sure that we do, sadly. Although I must pay tribute to Menna Elfyn, for example, 20 years ago was doing important work in Butau with the mixed ethnic communities there. Your work, it wasn't just that, it was followed up with Tolerant Nation, wasn't it? That collection of essays that you did with Neil Evans and with Paul O'Leary. That was, again, groundbreaking. Well, that's the wrong term, really. It was earthquake causing, really, because there was a shift in the great tectonic plates of Welsh culture, you know? The landscape changed. And I'm so pleased to have you report tonight on the progress that's been made in that respect. Is it enough? No, it's nowhere near enough. But at least it is progress, and I'm very proud of that. I remember 20 years ago, that very impressive thinker, Tony Bianchi, no longer with us, making a simple point, penetrating one about what he saw. He was a Geordie who settled in Wales, learned Welsh, wrote poetry in Welsh as well as novels, and of course, great figure in the Arts Council. I remember Tony writing a wonderful article for, I think it was Planet, where he said that traditionally, Wales had thought of itself in terms of time. Because after all, we are a people wrinkled deep in time. Not much more going for us than that, you know. But we are a people wrinkled deep in time. And that's always been present in all the ways that we think about ourselves and write about ourselves. But he said, there's now a shift happening to thinking of and writing about Wales as space. Now, there's something lost in that change, there's something gained. And what is gained has become evident from your talk tonight when you talked about spaces of possibility. It makes room for the variety that is the present, and that was not the past. Mm-hmm. And that, I think, is very, very important. Thank you for a fascinating overview of the present situation, which is also a sort of blueprint of how it might develop from here. I'm very grateful to you. Diolch yn fawr iawn i chi. So I will conclude with that.